this great opportunity. And both Rohit Sharma and Virat Kohli have scored centuries. I hope I am not Shivam Dubey to score a duck. So I need to back up and tell you something about the sodium, kidney and the hypertension link. I think all of us carry a bit of the ocean within us, because sodium is the most abundant element in the Earth's crust, and its water-soluble salt leach into the ocean, and it is the third most important abundant element in the ocean. And since life arose in the ocean, life evolved with cells bathed in the saline solution. So why this parable? This is when Krishna opened his mouth and Yashoda saw the whole universe. In the same way, we also carry a bit of ocean inside us, and that is the sodium or the saline solution. And these are the 10 top global risk factors for death. And you have the high blood pressure towering over every other aspect, and you also have a high sodium intake lurking somewhere there down. But make no mistake about it, it is the most important contributor for the hypertension and also chronic kidney disease. We'll just see how mechanistically these are intertwined. See, the epidemic of hypertension in 1900, while 1 in 20 adults had hypertension, and we have in the 2000, 1 in 3, and including the speaker is a hypertensive. So you have the, we can't go to the jungles of Amazon and then take up their eating habits, and you can see that these people's blood pressure, mean blood pressure is only 95/60, and there is absolutely no age-related increase in the blood pressure. Their blood pressure stands the same overall. If you are in 20 to 60 or 70, there is no increase in the age-related hypertension. And their 24 hours urine sodium is as low as 0.9 millimoles per day. So this came out of the InterSalt study in 2003. And the history of salt is the history of humankind itself. And the Chinese connection is everywhere, and the salt is no exception. Chinese extracted salt from the boiling seawater, and then all hell broke loose. And you have the Egyptians who believed that salt created sexual desire, so priests refused to eat it. And in short, salt was considered to be more precious than gold. And you have the Asterix, and you have the Celtics who really fought it against the Romans, and their empire was built on the salt exchange. The dietary salt intake varies across the countries, where Indians, as we have already seen, around 8 to 10 grams per day. So Chinese average around 11 grams, and we are closely following it. And in China and India, the sodium intake is dominated by the salt added in the cooking and on the table. So you can see the green countries where it is not so. And seeking the connection between the chronic kidney disease and hypertension, which came first? Is it the chicken or the egg? So this is again a topic of many decades which have been going on, and people who are nephrologists would always like to feel that it is the kidney which is the harbinger of all hypertensives, whereas the cardiologist would like to think that the hypertension begets the chronic kidney disease. But we need to understand that the iguana sneezes the sodium out, whereas we are not iguanas, and we depend on our kidneys to clear dietary sodium. And so impaired renal sodium clearance underpins all our hypertensive patients. And you can see that our nephrons are tuned towards conserving salt. And this is where the trouble comes in when we add excess amounts of salt than is physiologically needed. And you can see that only the excretion is less than 1% of the sodium which is coming in. And there is a defect in the salt excretion by our kidneys, where we have people who are very much sensitive to even increase in the salt intake of as low as 5 grams by raising their blood pressure, and these are the salt sensitive people. And this is where research is going to be set up in the very same institute, where we are going to see whether the salt sensitivity can be ascertained by a bedside test or a screening test that is going to come. So we have multiple reasons why kidneys are at the forefront of sodium retention, like sympathetic nervous activity, the low nephron numbers, which we have been endowed, and the problems of renin-angiotensin system, etc. So I don't think I'll go into the details of all these pathophysiology, but enough to understand that sodium retention is the starting point of trouble for hypertension. And you have multiple issues which come in once salt intake increases. So salt is being retained by the kidney, and the retained salt itself turns itself onto the kidneys to produce renal damage. So renin-angiotensin system is upregulated, and you have the upregulation of multiple transporters like epithelial sodium channels, the sodium chloride transporters, co-transporters, and also it is not just about the hemodynamics. Once there is excess salt in the tissue, it also leads on to inflammation. The body thinks that something amiss, and it is like a wound or something like an inflammation or ulcer, so I need to cure it. So inflammation sets in, and ultimately fibrosis sets in, and everything is stopped with the help of the fibrosis, where that is the death knell for all the organs, not only the kidney but also for the heart and also for the central nervous system. So you have multiple genetic abnormalities. You see that there are so many genetic polymorphisms which are being investigated for salt sensitivity. But what is more interesting, which is going to come up in this institute, is that we are going to have the exfoliated proximal convoluted cells from the urine and check the expression of the dopamine receptors. And it has been shown that when there is increase in the expression of the dopamine receptors, then these people are at a higher risk for salt sensitivity. And so the research proposal is on from this institute, and Professor RC is leading the research proposal. Despite recognition of the salt intake which is driving the hypertension, over the last 30 years we have not seen any reduction in the salt intake across the populations. So this is where we need to act, and this is where conferences like this are going to have a great say. And part of the reason is that there is some addictive behavior coming in because of the salty taste. The sodium which is being taken up by the epithelial sodium channels in the gustatory tissues of the tongue, which produce the nerves which are taking these sensations, go into the central nervous system and then provide some degree of addictive behavior. And the gustatory nerves, when there is salt aversion, the chloride ions, when the salt is excessively added, the salt aversion kicks in, and this is possibly due to the chloride ions. And the salt wars have been going on for many, many decades across the scientific communities, just like how the two presidents of US have been fighting last week. So the low salt reduces cardiovascular events for the rightists, whereas the leftists say that low salt increases the renin-angiotensin system activation and produces more damage. But always the rightists are right, and you need to believe them. So Paleolithic versus modern diet, you need to see that the Paleolithic diet had this 768 milligrams versus 10,500 milligrams of potassium. So much excess of potassium was there in the Paleolithic diet, whereas in the modern diet you have it is 5,000 is to 2,500. So there is, what is driving the hypertension is not only salt excess, it is the potassium deficit. So we need to see why potassium deficit also has to be corrected. So epidemiological data on the sodium has shown that every 1 gram dietary salt increases the systolic by 2 and a diastolic by 0.8. You may think that these are very, very small numbers, but you can see that the havoc created by even 2 millimeter rise of blood pressure is so many numbers of increase of stroke, cardiac failure, etc. And the epidemiological data on the potassium, for each 1 gram increase in potassium, you have a reduction of 3 millimeters of systolic and a 1.5 millimeters of diastolic blood pressure reduction. So not only should we reduce the sodium, we need to increase our potassium intake. Why is it important? This is where the basic science workup has given us a lot of inputs as to why potassium increase in the diet will drive the blood pressure down. There is something called a sodium switch which is happening all the time, minute to minute alterations in the way that the sodium and the potassium are handled by the renal tubular epithelial cells, especially the distal tubules. And what happens is, when there is a dietary or potassium reduction or dietary reduction of potassium, the body thinks that the potassium needs to be conserved and the sodium also needs to be conserved. So there is an excess activity of the sodium chloride co-transporter which is there in the distal tubules, and there is sodium coming in, and this is where the pathophysiology starts in. So potassium poor diet increases the NCC activity and sodium reabsorption, leading on to hypertension. So this so-called phosphorylation happens very quickly when there is a potassium poor diet. And when Chinese gave us the problem of salt, they also gave us some clue as to how to go about reducing the hypertension. So this is the salt substitute and stroke study, where they did an open label cluster randomized trial, and they enrolled as many as 20,000 people from 600 villages, and they carefully looked at their hypertension control and stroke incidence over a period of 5 to 7 years, and they used a salt substitute, 75% sodium chloride and 25% potassium chloride, compared to the use of regular salt. And they had the inclusion criteria were a history of stroke or with blood pressure more than 140 receiving antihypertensive drugs. The primary outcome was a stroke, and the secondary outcomes were multiple, and they found that systolic BP was down, and this was a very, very great outcome. And replacing table salt with a salt substitute had shown that there was a remarkable reduction in stroke, in major cardiovascular events, and mortality. Hyperkalemia was not very high. So the concerns of increasing the potassium intake in salt substitutes, which will increase the hyperkalemia risk, is not borne out in the general population. But there is a small area of concern in patients who have chronic kidney disease. You need to be careful. So as I was mulling over all these, and I was cutting mangoes for a pickle yesterday morning, and my wife was coming in with a big bowl of salt, I told her that we need to walk the talk, reduce the salt intake for this salt addition for this pickle. Otherwise, I will be delisted from the low salter group by Professor NC. Thank you.